planetary catastrophist theory advocated by David Talbot and myself is primarily a historical reconstruction. To date, we have largely focused our research on the eyewitness testimony of prehistoric sky watchers as revealed by ancient astronomical records and mythological traditions in order to piece together the recent history of the solar system. At the same time, we have argued that a catastrophic reordering of the solar system is indelibly encoded in prehistoric rock art and early languages. Such arguments form a recurring theme in my recent books, The Case of the Turquoise Sun, Egypt Under the Stars, and Snapshots of Creation. There is an additional body of evidence that offers compelling evidence in support of our historical reconstruction, hitherto overlooked by all scholars of ancient myth and religion. The evidence in question stems from the fact that early cultures around the globe ordered their cities and monumental structures in accordance with the belief system as above, so below. This idea was originally developed by the so-called Pan-Babylonians at the turn of the 20th century, a collection of world-class biblical scholars and Orientalists who held that the earliest religions of Mesopotamia were astronomical in nature and that societal structures such as cities and temples were expressly modeled upon a celestial prototype. According to this school, Mesopotamian temples represented the world mountain, a truism reflected already in the Sumerian temple hymns circa 2100 BCE, which routinely described the temple by names identifying it as the world mountain, Hersag, for example. Early cities, in turn, were quadripartite in appearance, being purposely laid out in accordance with the four cardinal directions. The theory was subsequently adopted and made famous by Mircea Eliade, arguably the most heralded scholar of myth and religion in the 20th century. Eliade documented that the same basic philosophy as above, so below prevailed in ancient Egypt, Vedic India, China, Old Europe, Oceania, and the New World. Central to Eliade's analysis is that creation formed the focal point of all ancient ideology and that human culture sought to model it in all monumental architecture. Quote, "Every construction or fabrication has the cosmogony as paradigmatic model." End of quote. According to Eliade, the original prototype for such belief systems is to be found in the sky. The ancient Mesopotamian temple, for example, was, quote, "the copy of a celestial work of architecture," end of quote. Maya temples, to take but one example, featured a pyramid which was explicitly identified as a world mountain. According to the esteemed scholar Karl Taube, Maya temples were deemed to be replicas of the celestial original. Quote, "Ancient temples were replications and encapsulations of the world," end of quote. But why should this be? What was there about the ancient sky that so impressed earthlings that they were compelled to model their cities and temples on it? And if this is true, as seems to be the case, how are we to explain the specific designs of ancient cities, which commonly feature a fourfold structure and a world pillar? Where in all of heaven is a cross-like structure and or a pillar-like object? A recent book entitled Heaven and Earth includes chapters by leading scholars on Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, Egypt, China, India, and Anatolia. It concludes that the belief system as above, so below is well-nigh universal in nature and central to understanding the ancient architecture. The editor of the book offered the following summary statement, quote, "Despite the extensive critiques leveled at the Pan-Babylonians and Eliade for their often inadequate usage of comparative data, scholars have continued to argue strongly for the utility, indeed the necessity, of comparison with regard to religion in general and sacred architecture in particular." End of quote. Yet in some 500 pages of analysis, not one word is spent explaining whence derived this curious belief system. Why do cultures everywhere remain fixated on the order of the cosmos established at the time of creation? Eliade himself never bothered to provide an answer to such questions, preferring instead to deal in metaphysical speculations and esoteric jargon, thereby leading scholars to dismiss his important findings as ahistorical and or mystical in nature. Enter Talbot and Cochrane. The catastrophist hypothesis offers a perfectly elegant and logical solution to the cultural phenomenon at hand. Shared cosmological ideologies, like recurring patterns in ancient myth, reflect common observations of catastrophic astronomical events during the relatively recent prehistoric period. Creation itself was a witnessed natural event involving catastrophic interactions between various celestial bodies. The universal belief in as above, so below traces to the fact that the cosmos ordered at creation was everywhere viewed as so awe-inspiring and wholly other that it came to be viewed as exemplary for all human behavior and cultural reality. It is as if the entire human species was imprinted with this memory of planetary catastrophe, whereupon the celestial landscape literally took shape right before their eyes. Such imprinting, such archaic shared memories as the cosmogram depicted earlier, shaped human cultures everywhere. The ancient conceptions surrounding the world pillar traced to the same extraordinary natural events. Eliade himself documented such ideas around the globe, among Australian Aborigines, Arctic herders, and the Kwakiutl of Northwest America. Of such traditions, Eliade reported, quote, "The sacrificial pole is called the pole of heaven and believed to support the sky," end of quote. Subsequent scholars have confirmed these findings. Witness the summary statement of Paul Kaiser, quote, "Thus, across 5 ancient culture zones, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, and Maya, there is a body of common belief in early mytho-historical cradle cosmology. The cosmos has a center, and at that center is a world tree, world pillar, or world mountain that serves as an axis and passageway," end of quote. A classic example of this belief system is the Indra pillar in ancient India. Indra was described as appearing as a world pillar in the Rig Veda, circa 1000 BCE, whereupon he was believed to uphold the cosmos in Atlas-like fashion. Indic rituals represented Indra as a giant tree and made it the subject of raucous rites featuring much din and merrymaking, the worshippers circling about the tree and dance while music blared in the background. Quote, "In India, a pole festooned with flowers and ornaments, called the Indra tree, is the center of a round dance. This Indic tree has a clear parallel in the European practice of dancing around the maypole, which must have been a tree originally," end of quote. Much as was the case with the indigenous cultures studied by Eliade, Indra's pillar was thought to be embodied in the central pillar of the Indic dwelling. So too scholars agree that the prototype for the Indra tree was in heaven. Quote, "The mythological prototype of the Indra tree was in heaven," end of quote. Analogous rites will be found around the globe. A close parallel is provided by the cult of the Slavic thunder god Perun, who was represented as a pole in ancient ritual. Here too celebrants danced around the pillar in ecstatic fashion. Quote, "Perun was especially celebrated at a spring festival in which young maidens would dance themselves to death in his honor, a practice that later became the inspiration for Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Over time, the rite was modified to become a ceremonial ring dance in which all the virgins in the village took part," end of quote. Ancient Greece preserves traces of similar rituals. Dionysus himself was represented as a pole-like object, and there too circular dances were commonplace. Witness the commentary of Henk Versnel, who referenced archaic artworks showing dancers circling the god. Quote, "The dance frequently circles around the god Dionysus, who is represented in the form of a stake or a pillar," end of quote. The origin of Greek tragedy, if we are to believe Aristotle and other ancient authorities, is to be sought for in the dithyramb associated with Dionysus, the latter of which featured circling dances and traditional songs. According to Plato, the dithyramb commemorated the god's epiphany in a fiery catastrophe, specifically in the thunderbolting of Semele, which resulted in his conception. Significantly, the cults of Dionysus and Indra have often been compared inasmuch as both gods are intimately associated with the origins of drama by their respective cultures. A striking parallel is attested in the New World, where an ancient Aztec festival was marked by the erection of a giant tree known as a Zacatl pole, which had been carefully cut and decorated for the occasion. The renowned ethnographer Bernardino de Sahugan described the ritual custom as follows, quote, "There was piled up for themselves, there was provided a mound of earth by means of which the pillar was erected. Strength was indeed exerted, they each took hold of it with all their force, and the Zacatl image they fashioned was of flesh. And when it was made ready, thereupon they set it up. Then there was an outcry, there was shouting. And when this was done, it was quickly erected. Much did the earth stir, much did it move and swirl." End of quote. The similarities between the Aztec ritual and the Indra festival extended to the finest details. If Indra's pole was erected under much pomp and din, so too was the Zacatl pole, greeted with shouting and accompanying din. Perhaps the most important question is whether there is any evidence of dancing associated with the Aztec tree. On page 28 of the Codex Bourbonicus, there is a painting of the Zacatl tree. Evident at once are the dancers circling about the arboreal pole. Granted that the Zacatl pole, like Indra's pole, represents the world pillar of ancient cosmology, how are we to understand the circling dancers? Greek tragedians provide the answers. The dancers are circling stars. Quote, "The scholiast to Sophocles' Antigone, 1146, reports that Dionysus was called chorus leader of the stars in accordance with some doctrine of the mysteries." End of quote. The late Bill Mullen, a professor of classics at Bard and a frequent speaker at EU conferences, wrote an entire book on these circling dances, concluding, quote, "The history of mankind's imitations of the heavens in dance is universal." End of quote. Eric Sapo likewise observed, quote, "The idea that the stars perform a circular dance, an occultic dance around an altar, is, as we have seen, much older." End of quote. Here I would draw attention to the curious tie-like object adorning the Aztec pole. The central tie is virtually indistinguishable from the Egyptian Ankh sign, while the associated banner with streamers bears a striking resemblance to the Sumerian pictograph that designated Inanna Venus, the so-called Mush sign. How are we to understand the cosmological significance attached to this tie? Certainly it is significant to find that in ancient Babylonian cosmology, the world pillar was explicitly associated with a tie identified with the planet Venus. Thus, in the late Babylonian hymn known as the Exaltation of Ishtar, the planet goddess is described as holding the bond of the sky. Quote, "Many astral motifs are in fact attested. Ishtar's elevation tells us that An married her on the urging of the gods and asked her to hold and rule the tie of the support of the sky." End of quote. The Akkadian word for this sky support, Paluku, is to be equated with the Sumerian Bulug, a common name for the world pillar in Mesopotamian cosmology. Now, it can hardly be an accident that wherever world pillars are found, they are typically said to be adorned by garlands or band-like ties. Witness the Egyptian pillar. The resemblance to the Aztec Zacatl pillar is evident at once. The classic Egyptian symbol of the world pillar was the so-called Djed pillar. Here, too, a curious tie with the Queen of Heaven is in evidence. Witness the commentary of Rundle Clark. Quote, "The idea of the Djed column is that it stands firmly upright. The word Djed means stable or durable. If this is taken into consideration, it is easy to see why the column could be used as a cosmic pillar or sky support, as well as a symbol of revival. As early as the Second Dynasty, a well-known stela has a support made from a composite column formed of a djed, and underneath a strange object known as a tit, a knot of cloth or leather. This was the emblem of Isis, or of the mother goddess in general." End of quote. Taking these archaic traditions from India, Greece, Mesoamerica, and Egypt as relatively faithful memories of extraordinary astronomical events, the underlying message seems to be that during the period associated with the polar configuration, the planet Mars, as the world pillar, was located in close proximity to Venus, which appeared to encircle it as a band or tie. Those readers familiar with the writings of Talbot and myself will know that this is exactly how we have described Venus for the past 40 years now. It is here that common sense and critical judgment must lead the way and carry the day. It is simply impossible that ancient cultures all around the globe would spontaneously arrive at the very same ideas surrounding the world pillar upon contemplation of the invisible cosmic axis or by creative imagination. Rather, some tangible celestial structure, some historical stimulus, must have provided the visual inspiration for the universal cosmogonical traditions and ritual practices attached to the world pillar. The historical prototype, the divine exemplar as it were, existed in heaven first and only later became purposely modeled by earthlings below in their religious rituals and engineering programs. And what is true of the world pillar is true of cosmogonic myths and associated symbols everywhere. To recap our discussion, the Pan-Babylonians and Eliade were right to emphasize the remarkable fact that ancient cultures everywhere ordered their cities and sacred structures in accordance with the celestial prototype. No amount of hand-waving is going to make this voluminous evidence go away. Eliade went wrong when he abandoned the Pan-Babylonians' key insight that ancient religion traced to astronomical determinants and had a historical component. Most important, perhaps, is that Eliade and the Pan-Babylonians both made a fundamental mistake in disregarding the catastrophic aspects of ancient cosmogonies, the latter of which traced directly to planetary catastrophes in the recent prehistoric past. Eliade himself observed that, quote, myths of cosmic cataclysms are extremely widespread, end of quote. In order to arrive at an evidence-based historical reconstruction, it is necessary for students of ancient myth and modern astronomers alike to go back to the origins of human civilization and actually confront the ubiquitous evidence pointing to planetary catastrophe. The evidence in question is at once unequivocal and paradigm-shifting.